Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. And as usual, we'd like to start the main program with the recitation of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض، له الملك وله الحمد وهو على كل شيء قدير. هو الذي خلقكم فمنكم كافر ومنكم مؤمن والله بما تعملون بصير. خلق السماوات والأرض بالحق وصوركم فأحسن صوركم وإليه المصير. يعلم ما في السماوات والأرض ويعلم ما تسرون وما تعلنون والله عليم بذات الصدور. ألم يأتكم نبأ الذين كفروا من قبل فذاقوا وبال أمرهم ولهم عذاب أليم. ذلك بأنه كانت تأتيهم رسلهم بالبينات فقالوا أبشر يهدوننا فكفروا وتولوا واستغنى الله والله غني حميد. زعم الذين كفروا أن لن يبعثوا قل بلى وربي لتبعثن ثم لتنبؤن بما عملتم وذلك على الله يسير. فآمنوا بالله ورسوله والنور الذي أنزلنا والله بما تعملون خبير. يوم يجمعكم ليوم الجمع ذلك يوم التغابن. ومن يؤمن بالله ويعمل صالحا يكفر عنه سيئاته ويدخله جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا ذلك الفوز العظيم. والذين كفروا وكذبوا بآياتنا أولئك أصحاب النار خالدين فيها وبئس المصير. ما أصاب من مصيبة إلا بإذن الله ومن يؤمن بالله يهد قلبه والله بكل شيء عليم. وأطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول فإن توليتم فإنما على رسولنا البلاغ المبين. الله لا إله إلا هو وعلى الله فليتوكل المؤمنون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن من أزواجكم وأولادكم عدوا لكم فاحذروهم وإن تعفوا وتصفحوا وتغفروا فإن الله غفور رحيم. إنما أموالكم وأولادكم فتنة والله عنده أجر عظيم. فاتقوا الله ما استطعتم واسمعوا وأطيعوا وأنفقوا خيرا لأنفسكم ومن يوق شح نفسه فأولئك هم المفلحون. إن تقرضوا الله قرضا حسنا يضاعفه لكم ويغفر لكم والله شكور حليم. عالم الغيب والشهادة العزيز الحكيم صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. Today we're very fortunate to have Professor Jonas Otterbeck, who will be speaking to us about Islamic-themed pop music, creativity, and ethics. Professor Jonas is a Professor of Islamic Studies and the head of research and the holder of the Rasul Walker Chair in Popular Culture and Islam at the Aga Khan University. Over the last 25 years, he's engaged in research about contemporary Islam, often with political relevance. His most recent research is on Islamic pop music, and especially the media company Awakening and artists like Maher Zain, J and Raef. He also has an interest in research on music censorship and an engagement for artists' right to expression. And before moving to Aga Khan University in September 2018, he was Professor of Islamic Studies at London University. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Jonas.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the beautiful recitation, whoever was responsible for that. I've been asked to come here basically because I've newly written a book called The Awakening of Islamic Pop Music. And actually, it's an interesting book because it's now open access already. So at the end of the talk, I will share a link. So if you like what you hear or are curious about what I'm writing, you can download it for free. So Islamic-themed pop, creativity and ethics. I will sort of concentrate on that aspect, the last one, the ethics aspect, because when I wrote the book, it was pretty clear that ethics was extremely important to the artists of Awakening that I talked to. And one of the earliest stars of Awakening is Sami Yusuf, who then left the company in 2008, but he's the one portrayed here on the first slide. But let's go. So one of the first things I'm going to do is talk a little about the ethical turn in Islamic theology. Then I'm going to look into the history of the pop nasheed phenomena and then the development of ethics in pop. So the ethical turn, let's start in that end. Basically, it's what scholars try to sort of grasp a development where you can see a certain trend, not a total turn, of course, but a certain trend that some of the younger theologians, not least, are arguing more going from rule-oriented to ethics-oriented Islamic theology, basically, or akhlaq and ilm al-akhlaq and adab and things like that. Or at least there is a stress on the complementary side of fiqh and ethics in Sharia. So let's have a quote on that. So Sharif Banna, who has written a dissertation, a PhD dissertation in Al-Azhar, he writes like this: I would contend that the term Islamic has both legal and ethical dimensions. If it's permissible in law, fiqh that is, then it is halal or mubah, permitted. And if it's validated by the ethical standards of Islam, only then does it become Islamic. Legislation and ethics are two sides of the same coin, and it continues. And his favorite example is actually a big car that really devours petrol. And you can say there's nothing in fiqh who says that you can't drive that, but actually ethics might prevent you. And you have to take in both the fiqh side and the ethics sides into your argument, is his argument, when he is arguing about a responsibility before God when it comes to taking care of the environment. There has been a clear sort of trend to write about maqasid al-Sharia in the 21st century. Actually, if you go out in one of the huge library and search for maqasid al-Sharia, both in English and Arabic and Persian volumes, you will find that, yes, there are those writing in history like Al-Ghazali, Al-Shatibi, who's mentioned on the slide. They have mentioned it, and they mean basically the same as what is meant today. But if you look at literature before the turn of the 21st century, there's only a few examples. If you look after, there's an explosion. A number of people are leading this development, among them Yasser Auda, Tariq Ramadan, Muhammad Hashim El-Kimeli, all of them writing in the US or the UK. And Yasser Al-Auda is now leading a Maqasid Sharia Institute, which takes him from Canada to Qatar regularly. What I see, and what several others who try to follow this development see, is that the Maqasid Sharia has a stress on ethics. It is sort of a discourse within fiqh, but it has to do with the purpose of Sharia. So it approaches Sharia holistically and looks for the principle, which is basically a turn to ethics. That's my argument. Now, if we look at the creativity and popular culture field, we see a massive engagement from Muslim artists. They work with the ambition, some of them at least, to come across as Islamic, as the Awakening artists do. And there they use Islam as a pool of resources for their lyrics, for their videos, for their performances. There are, of course, others who act relating to Islam, who might be positive, negative, challenging. They might be ambivalent, but they still use Islam as a pool of resources in this general popular culture relating to Islam field. On the slide, you see Dawood Warnsby and Zain Bika, Dawood from Canada and Zain from South Africa, who both of them pioneered a new form of nasheed that I will talk about in a few minutes' time. The classical nasheed field, you might know that nashada, nasheed, means reciting poetry and tapping into singing, and nasheed has generally for a very long time in Arabic and some other languages also meant song. It's a generic word for song. So it can be a nationalist song, it can be a devout Islamic song, but it can also be a devout Christian song, for example. But in the field that I'm looking at, which is very much Islam in Europe, nasheed is coded very much as an Islamic song, and it has sort of grown into an Islamic genre. And you can see that the tradition is that it's vocal based, it's male dominated. You could have the occasional drum or hand clapping, but it's basically vocal based, the classical nasheed. And classically, it was improvised rather than composed. So it was very much relating to the musicianship of the munshid, the singer. Ideally, they would know a number of scales and a number of poems, and in their performance, they could then create and originally recompose and redraft songs live. And that was sort of a performance-oriented thing that was appreciated. Now, what changes with the 20th century and consumer culture and industrialism and mass culture is, of course, that you now can record things. And when you can record things, the recorded song becomes the original in a way. And it becomes not only a capture of a live performance, it becomes what people, the audience, expect to hear, which changes this performance-oriented style, which often was very, very long, and you could sort of build on a cycle of 30, 40, 50 minutes. When it goes into recordings, the recorded music becomes shorter, more pregnant, more sort of to the point, and also instruments are brought in. Especially in the early period, there are huge orchestra brought in to illustrate the nasheed, because that was the trend of the day. So that also leads to a composition of religious nasheed and a marketing of them, and they are then put on stage and performed to a sitting audience or a standing audience in a completely different way than the classical nasheed. So the recording changed the nasheed scene already then. On the image there, you see one of the first stars on this new nasheed scene, but where there still was the classical one, the Egyptian Munshid al-Naqshbandi, who was a huge star in the 60s and 70s, and still his recordings are revered by a lot of people. Now, there is a change which is a bit unexpected, I would say. It is that in the 70s, in states like Syria, and especially Syria, there are people from the Ikhwani circles, the Muslim Brotherhood circles, who use the invention of the cassette recorder and cheap recordings to record songs protesting against the Syrian regime. So names like Abu Mazen, and then after a while Abu Ratib, records these very highly political nasheed, where they take the nasheed form, some of the trends, the tonal languages, the fact that they do vocals only, the sparse accompanying of hand clapping. That is rather typical of this period. And you can see that in the Dawah al-Islamiyya, as it's generally called in the Arabic, the Islamic call. They appropriate this politicized form. Eventually, it leads to male choirs. If you're really interested in this, you can try to find, if you read Arabic, there are this is a book cover, the image, and you can find that online. If you can't find it, you can always pop me an email and ask me to send you a copy or a link, because I have them downloaded. But this style, it spreads. It becomes sort of a subcultural protest song style, framing this kind of political singing. And Hamas and Hezbollah participates, and quite a number of my research friends and also my Muslim friends hear that kind of nasheed in the 70s, in the 80s, and it does have an impact. So, for example, in Indonesia, Malaysia, there grows a political Islamic nasheed scene around what is called Arkam, and I've listed some of the prominent artists there: Nada Murni, the Dhikr, and eventually the Dhikr is transformed into Rayhan, and Rayhan has another view of it. And strangely enough, in that middle of the 90s, there is a number of artists in different countries all over the world that transitions in the same way. They go from the political, or takes the energy of the political nasheed and combines it with pure pop. So Rayhan is pioneers. They have an EMI record out in Malaysia, still one of the best-selling record, this Puji Pujian that you see record sleeve of there. It's out in 96. It outsells everything else, every secular record, everything else. Zain Bika in South Africa has already started in 94 to manufacture cassettes, makes him sort of locally famous, but his breakthrough is later in the 90s. But he is recording English nasheed in South Africa in 94 already. Yusuf Islam, former pop star Cat Stevens, is doing similar things as a reaction to the Bosnian strife and the Bosnian genocide, where he acknowledges the power of music, and he wants to do songs again after withdrawing from the music scene. So he appears again on the scene in 1995 with a few tracks. And in Canada, Dode Warnsby, a former Irish, sort of singing Irish troubadour music, converts to Islam and starts in 96 to make children's music. English Islamic-themed children's music. So it's really interesting how this sort of happens in a few years around the mid-90s. And then that trend lasts approximately 10 years. So when Awakening launches Sami Yusuf in 2003, and I'll return to that, this is still the paradigm of Islamic pop. And it's called nasheed generally. I've preferred to call it pop nasheed because it gives me a vehicle to separate it from traditional nasheed. It's not necessarily called pop nasheed. Fans generally just call it nasheed. There is a change, as I said, 10 years after the breakthrough, and it's a change to instrumentation because, and I'll return to this, because of ideas in Islamic theology that many of you probably are well aware of. You can interpret Islamic theology as condemning stringed instrument, wind instrument. So people were very careful not to bring in instrument in this early wave, building on that vocals only tradition that the political Islam has brought into it, but also that these early pop artists did bring into it, even though some of them were accomplished musicians. Ryan is the first to slowly change this in a record in 2001. Yusuf Islam brings the guitar on stage 2005. His son buys a guitar and it's lying around at home and he picks it up for the first time in many years, he says. Dawood Warnsby had never stopped playing the guitar, but he didn't record with the guitar, but he started in some recordings in 2003 that was issued in 2005. Sami Yusuf, 2005 album is fully instrumentalized. Zain Bika, on the other hand, has chosen bigger productions, digital pads, as it's called in recording language, where you have sort of these, you sample the voice and then you produce it as accords. You press a number of keys and it's this whoa, big landscape sound. So you can very, very much like paint with these pads to get a big production. He uses that a lot, but not instruments as such. And this has actually made vocals only into a genre and a production technique, but it's also very much intertwined with this ethics of producing music without instruments is seen by a number of the audience and a number of the artists as a more ethical understanding of Islam. Some of them actually do both. They produce a fully instrumentalized album and then a vocals only. And the audience consume that, then feeling that that's an ethical way of doing it too, that you produce for different audience to cater for them as a service. I'm not entirely certain what happens around 2005, why this development is there. And I've asked several of the artists that I've interviewed, and they all know that it happened, but they can't really pinpoint why. It might actually be, one of the ideas that I have, that Sami Yusuf, his being propelled to fame was crucial for this development because he is a school musician. He's trained in classical Persian instruments, violin, percussion, and piano. And he wanted to play music on his second album. He was adamant about that. But still, the same process was happening around. So it's difficult to say. Also, you can see that some leading theologians like Abdullah al-Judai, which is a Hanafi, I'm pretty sure, no, he's Maliki, scholar from Iraq, and he lives in Leeds nowadays, but he wrote like a 300-page book in Arabic about the legality of instruments and music, basing himself on classical theology, especially certain parts of Ghazali. Is pretty close to certain parts of Ghazali's argument. And you can, if you're curious about it, you can find summaries of al-Judai's conclusions online, and you can see how he evaluates this. Because of course there are other voices claiming that it's completely wrong, sorry. But we can see that there is a change of attitude because of this new offer of touring artists who are with other musicians performing a new nasheed music. You can see that in Islamic gatherings, Eid celebrations, huge conferences, that music becomes more and more often part of this. And having gone to a number of these meetings, I would say that this change is gradual. It already happens in the mid-90s, but the big change is in the early first decade of the 21st century, I would say. Now it's very much expected and anticipated, and it's also acknowledged that it pulls the young ones to the conferences. So this study about awakening records, what was that about? Well, let me take you through very quickly Awakening's history. It was founded in London in 2000. 4 men in their 20s. At least 2 of them have parents who have been very, very active in Islamic circles, in Sunni Islamic revivalist circles. The first product was this book that you see here, The Seer of the Final Prophet, that Sharif Hassan al-Banna, who's his full name, named after Hassan al-Banna by his father, who admired Hassan al-Banna. He now tries to go by the name Sharif Banna, by the way. He wrote it when he was 16 years old, encouraged by his father, and then they couldn't publish it. But when he was around 20, with a student friend, they started saying that, no, we could get it out, but we should aim for high quality. And this was the aim already from the beginning in Awakening. If we're going to go into popular culture, if we're going to do production, it's going to be high quality or not. We're not going to do it if it's not. So, more about the background. This man, Sami Yusuf, was signed 2003. He's an old childhood friend to one of the founders, Barak Khareji. And Barak Khareji is sort of one of those who have Islamist fathers. Rashid Ghanouchi, from the Nahda party in Tunisia, is his dad. So we are talking about activist nobility, let's call it that, maybe. But his dad has nothing to do with his deed with Awakening. It's just sort of the connection if you made it from the family name. They release an album called Muallim. They make a video, a serious video, that is positioned on Melody Hits, which is a sort of an Egyptian MTV-ish channel, so for commercial music. So it sticks out because there are sort of channels that play religious music, but they wanted it to be played in the secular channel. And it just made a big splash. It propelled Sami Yusuf into fame overnight. Half a year later, he performs in Cairo Opera House during Ramadan. And after that, it's just sort of, well, his fame becomes incredible. He really becomes a global superstar. Now, that was the start. Eventually, they lost him 2008. There was a big row. I won't go into that. But they managed to reform, find new artists like Maher Zain. Masood Curtis was already there. But others like Raef, Harris J was signed. And they have been doing very good. So as of now, we could definitely call them globally a leading Muslim media company. Locally, they might be larger, but globally, there are a few actors that can compete with them. One trait is that they only have male artists up until now. They tried to launch one in the autumn 2020, Imam, but it didn't really work out as of now. You see some figures there, which is pretty impressive. They have more than 3 billion views on YouTube. Their most famous songs is viewed 300 million times an individual video. So they're quite successful, actually. Not Lady Gaga successful, but next league. Sharif al-Banna, he describes Awakening like this. Music is at the forefront of a culture conduit which reaches and impacts millions. It is everywhere. Faith-conscious Muslim artists are now producing Islamic music as an attempt to provide an alternative to mainstream pop culture. And they also, in their self-description, use words like faith-based and value-driven music, and pretty pretentious. Awakening's intention was not to reform Islam, but to contemporize it. And there's a logic to that claim, that they wanted sort of to bring in a modern popular culture and to bring in not the poor quality of print, but sort of the full quality. So it should look as good as any book, run as good as any video, run as good as any song. Other things that ties into this ethics side is that they try to offer moral and meaningful songs in contrast to what they call hedonistic pop and rock, to offer love for Allah, the Prophet, and mankind in contrast with mainstream pop. The music artists will have to communicate the beneficial and the beautiful, not the beastly and the base. Now, how is that done? If you want to sort of do this beautifully, well, I'm going to try this. This is not going to work out very good, I think, because generally when you play anything like this over, right, I can't even play it. The support team, can you figure out how we can play this? Link. I'll continue at the same time as you figure this out, okay? So what you can see in the first generation of videos up until 2014, I would say, is that to contrast with general consumer culture, videos tend to be slow instead of very fast in the camera angles. Things are going slow. It does not contain any dancing. Okay, it says here we can't play a YouTube video. Sorry about that. I'll discuss it a little later, and you can look at this afterwards. I'll give you a little cue, but I'll run through my list here. So they don't contain the dancing. They tend to be beautifully filmed. There's sort of beautiful settings, and they stress the modern, but they also stress the modest. And there is a stress on kindness and ethics. For example, it's pretty often you can see couples holding hands, caring for each other, from anything from just sort of lifting each other's up, opening doors, giving breakfast in bed, hugging, smiling. And we see a lot of settings, historical mosques, calligraphy, that are filmed in a rather beautiful way. And they consciously also place quite a lot of the videos in an upscale, non-marginalized Muslimness beyond the integration discourse. And what do I mean by that? Well, you would see that they are in upper middle class homes in the US or in Cairo in the upper strata, showing that, showing off a fashion, showing off that Muslims are not only poor. Of course, there are a lot of poor Muslims, not least in this country, but there are wealth, there are culture, there is sort of a fineness, a refined culture. Now, the video I was going to play was Ya Nabi Salam Alayka, and I'll write that in the chat here. And you can see that in many different platforms. It was by Maher Zain. It's filmed in Chicago. And basically, the film shows how Maher goes around to different people working in different fields, shake their hand or bows, hands over a card celebrating the love for Muhammad. And then when they open that little envelope and read, a spark goes up to the sky, and eventually an astronaut out in space watches this spark and smiles because he recognized it as a divine spark, basically. When they play live, I mentioned that they went from playback, and now this regular with full bands. And thank you for that, posting that. And the mediated image in the video is very controlled, while the live with the live musicians has a lot of energy into it, and therefore the audience and the relation to the audience becomes rather difficult to control for them. There is the the idealization of the staged personality, and there's always the risk of the sexualization of the staged personality. And the persona on stage draws all the attention to it. Being then young, handsome men with good voices, there is quite a lot of Muslim pride going on, but also a lot of emotions, people screaming from the top of the voices. And when touring with them in the UK, I can definitely say from the 20-something concerts I attended that there was a majority of women of different ages, but not least younger women, who tried out the fangirl scream and also tried out screaming "Maher, I love you," things like that. That kind of fan, what a fan can allow themselves in comparison to what the staged persona can. And because of this pressure, there was a constant discussion in the green room backstage about ethics. How can we deal with this? How do we deal with the screams? Do we deal with people standing up dancing? How do we communicate that we want them to sit down and not scream? How do we communicate the joy that we want them to feel without tipping over to this adulation, for example? There's a really interesting discussion about ethics and how to behave, very often drawing from classical ethics of different sorts. And with classical ethics, I mean ilm al-akhlaq and adab, so the morals and ethics of Islam. You can also see that music was used as a tool of mobilization, to mobilize people and consciousness of Muslim strife all over the world. Many of the concerts were made as charity events, where they gathered enormous sums of money to send through Human Appeal, Penny Appeal, and other organizations to, for example, girls' schools in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or different poverty projects, or anti-poverty projects, that should be. Now, I mentioned 2014, and around that time, you could see that social media gains a new role. So to communicate, before you could stage everything. Apart from the live moment, you could have the videos under control, the promotion shots under control. But with the increasing expectation on artists to go and be active on social media, interactive social media, and the celebrity culture that comes with that from the fans, Awakening also took the decision to be early on to launch their artists in social media. But that also meant that the artists themselves became the curator of their persona. So they had to be very careful of what they were doing, but they weren't that careful. And because they're spontaneous and because they're sort of closer to their own lives, this brought in a new kind of playfulness. Before, the masculinity was very staged, very handsome, very controlled. But after 2014, there's a variety of masculinities from each and every person, where they see Maher Zain training or going to Hajj or very different things, or Harris J taking a swim in Malaysian pool at the hotel, and different things. And people react very differently to this. And you can see, especially with a young artist like Harris J, who's now like 24, 25 possibly, who had his breakthrough when he was 15. There's a lot of fan culture around him. And being a very handsome young man, there was also a sexualization of him going on his Instagram account that was, well, not very Islamic ethically, if I phrase it like that. So there is an awareness of the need to be authentic, but also an understanding that authenticity cannot only be staged these days. Today, you expect that little social media twist on the personalities broadcasted. I'm not going to play the video there then. It's an interesting little video, and I'll write that in the chat again, and then it'll appear. It's by a Washington artist called Raef, who did a song called Deck the Hall, which is a Christmas song. And he launched it as the Muslim Christmas song, and sang a Christmas song about Jesus and Muhammad, partly in Arabic and partly in English, but staging it as a, not ironic, but a glimpse in the eye video where he sits like the typical American father in the sweater with a roaring fire, baking cakes and singing together with friends and family. And there was a lot of reactions. It's really interesting to go through the chat below, because there's a lot of feelings, and some people write almost respectfully but angry, like, Raef, I love your stuff, but this is so wrong. And other people say, no, you don't get it. This is exactly how we are part of this. We love Jesus too. Why shouldn't we do a Christmas song? And it's a interesting phenomena, to say the least. I'm keeping track of time if you're worried about that, the ones who are in charge. Now, I'll only browse this. The sound of pop Islam, one of the things that I mentioned is that the sound could be vocals only, thus shunning instruments. Others say that, no, I can bring a guitar on stage, that's no problem, as long as I don't make the electric guitar sound, the distorted electric guitar sound. So Maher Zain, for example, never have electric distorted guitars on his albums. He may have an electric guitar, but not distorted. While Raef, who's schooled as a guitarist, has no problem whatsoever. Or Hamza Namira, an Egyptian artist also, who happily plays the distorted guitar, doesn't feel that that is un-Islamic. So different artists will value the sound of Islam, the ethical sound of Islam differently, and cater for their audience carefully. What kind of persona, what kind of person do they want to come across as? And it goes all the way into the production, all the way into the choice of instrument, the sound of instruments, not only the lyrics and the videos. This is really, really thought through. So we can see that when this kind of pop music is created, it is a praxis, but it's negotiated with a broader theology. I mean, with theology here, I mean sort of ideas about religion, including ethics. And there is a need for artists to build that persona that in scholarly language is called the ethical self. That is the ethical construct of who you are before yourself, but also before others. And touring with these awakening artists, they are not sort of pop stars who go and pose on the stage. They live the part. They live the part all the way down to stopping the bus and praying a prayer time. And they're really not keeping a facade. They're doing it as proper as they can, as proper as anyone can, because everyone slips and slides, but they're really attempting to live the role. Definitely the new nasheed scene is intertwined with both ethnic and Muslim pride. And what do I mean with that? Well, for example, some of my Jewish friends, they're very proud of a number of artists like Leonard Cohen, even though he turned Zen Buddhist before he died. And a lot of Muslim friends are very proud of Mo Salah of Liverpool. And at the same time, I've found that students of mine claim Maher Zain. So I had a discussion with a Palestinian woman, a female student, who said that Maher Zain is Palestinian. And I happen to know that he's Lebanese, but not Palestinian, grew up in Sweden. And we had a discussion about that, and she claimed him, and it was important for her to claim him because he was part of an ethnic pride, not only a Muslim pride. And I can see that with artists like Mesut Curtis, who is from the Turkish minority group in North Macedonia, for example, the way that he is claimed by people. But it's also an important part about contribution and integration. And as you probably are all well aware, there is a flaw in the integration discussion in many of the Western European countries, because it always starts with sort of the state's intention about integration. So what do we want from the migrant? What do we want? When is it enough for us? Instead of saying, what is the contribution? What kind of contributions does Muslims in, let's say, UK make? What kind of culture production? What kind of work production? Not work production, but work and other things. So what kind of contribution are there? There's a lot of contribution. So the integration debate could be sort of challenged with the contribution debate. And this is one of the projects, the overall projects that I have to sort of, not turn it around, because we need to discuss different problems, socioeconomic problems for any group, and not least for, let's say, the Bangladeshi group and in Manchester and Birmingham. It's pertinent that we get the socioeconomic conditions right and understands that. But we also need to complement that with a discussion about contribution. When this contribution is made in the music scene, there's an interesting conflation between the morally good as beautiful in a very Platonic way, in the sense that Plato had the idea that the beautiful have to be, or rather, art has to be morally good to be beautiful. Otherwise, it is not beautiful per definition. It can't sort of be aesthetically beautiful. It has to be morally beautiful. And you can see that discourse in the pop nasheed phenomena. It has to be morally good to be good music in that sense. And this affects the production and in every single aspect. And it's also affects which artist can a company like Awakening even sign. Now, that's sort of a rather hasty work through of the complexities that you can write if you have 200 pages, which I happen to have had in a book called The Awakening of Islamic Pop Music. And you can find that either if you just take down the title and go to Edinburgh University Press and type down my name, Jonas Otterbeck, then you will find that it's given away for free. It's open access on their page, but you have to register. But I promise you, they will not ask for any money while you're registering. I've done it. I've done my registering and downloaded a copy just to see that it works. But what also happens is that suddenly you have access to hundreds of Edinburgh University Press books that are open access for free. You can just download them. Or you can use this link to AKU, to our e-commons, which is basically a big server where we upload things that we have published. And you can either find that by writing e-commons AKU and the Awakening of Islamic Pop Music, or my name, and you're very likely to get it. Or you can photograph the link as it stands there, and you can find the book. Or if you are very keen on buying it, you can buy it hardback for 75 quids. But I guess that you'd rather download it. Right, that's the first part. And let's open for questions. There's lots and lots of more to discuss. I've only browsed a number of topics, but I hope it serves as a thorough introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk and for the overview that you've given on this really interesting topic that you've obviously written extensively on. The first question that's come through is, do you see any difference between Shia and Sunni approaches to Islamic pop music or nasheeds?
Well, the ones that I've studied are Sunnis, and there's always sort of a discussion about, well, is Sami Yusuf really Sunni or Shia? He tends to avoid the question in public and portrays himself mainly as a Sufi, following the Mariamiyya order, which happens to be led by Sayyid Hussein Nasr, which comes from a Shia background. So in that way, no one really knows. But what I've basically taken down is the Sunni story. I haven't studied the Shia version of this. There is, however, a dissertation about the Hezbollah production, so the political side of it. So a woman called Karin Berg wrote her dissertation about, I'm writing it in the chat here. She wrote her dissertation about Hamas and Hezbollah, 2 case studies. And what she could see was that in the Hezbollah case, it was very much a movement music. So they employed in their Risala, which is basically their culture ministry, they employ musicians, they have a studio of their own, and the musicians are tasked to write in different genres, like niyas, sort of things like that, sort of elegies and songs to praise songs, etc., to be used in political activities and processions. There is, of course, the other people like Salim Suleiman from the Ismaili group, who's a big Bollywood composition duo who have a Shia background, and Maher Zain has worked together with them. So in that case, when they made a song together, and they're not sort of strictly, they're not nasheed artists in that sense, but they do meddle in it, it did sound exactly the same. I guess that there is a rather huge local scene in Iran, in Azerbaijan, that I have not studied, and I hadn't read that much about it either. So I'm curious if anyone has an idea about that, please share.
Thank you very much. The second question is coming is about, do you see a big difference between Islamic music and music which happens to be done by Muslims? And what do you think are the biggest drivers of Islamic specific music?
Thank you for that question. That's one thing that is always difficult for someone in Islamic studies to avoid using these words. When I talk about this is purposely made to come across as devout. So let me even say that even more complex. The artist and Awakening has the ambition to come across as devout, and therefore they sometimes call their music faith-driven. Islamic music becomes sort of a sloppy shorthand that is needed when you don't have like 200 pages. You can be much more nuanced. There's a lot of musicians with a religious background, Muslim or not, who do not necessarily do music that taps into their religion. At times they might break out in a Allah or God or Jesus or whatever they'd like to refer to. And from a scholarly point of view, that's interesting, because what you do basically then is that you mobilize symbols that are connected to religion. Now, when you do that fully, when you build up a devout persona, you will be very conscious about that. It will be possibly in your clothing, in your speech, in the way that you the lyrics that you sing, the movement that you have, by avoiding certain movements like dance. but that's when it's extremely conscious. But it can also go all the way down to the way that most of us, regardless of which religion we belong to, we will have it in our language. And even people who are atheists would say, oh my God, or Yallah, or whatever, Wallahi, and it will just be there. People will mobilize these things that signal religion. But so, to the question again, yeah, I do separate. And when I write about this, I tend to write nasheed, pop nasheed, and Islamic pop. And then I define that. I tend to avoid Islamic music because that sounds very much like ritual music. And ritual music, depending on what we want to do with the word music, we can definitely say that there are ritual tonal expressions in Islam. And we could, of course, call that Islamic ritual tonal expression. And no one will sort of object of saying that a Quranic recitation is a tonal expression, or the adhan, the call to prayer. Some would definitely object calling it music. So it's a matter of definition and politics around these words. So I hope that was answer enough. I hope I didn't babble. But the idea basically is that, yes, it can be an efficient shorthand, but it can also, because of that, confuse matters. And what I've studied doing Islamic studies is focusing on people who want to come across as Muslim. But I've also actually written an article about those who like to not come across as Muslim using Islamic symbols anyway. For example, for the purpose of Islamophobia, you would use the same kind of symbols if you want to slight Muslims as Muslims themselves would use, because that kind of slighting will be more efficient in that sense.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me ask the next question from Muhammad Manji. What is your view on the future of Islamic pop music with the next generation of artists such as Haris J? Is the ethical Islamic music we see today likely to survive as we know it, or is it heading towards dilution and non-descriptiveness?
Oh, that was basically answer the question in the question. Yes, that's definitely a possibility that you sketched out there. And Haris is extremely interesting when it comes to this. I did not include interviews with Haris. I've talked to him, toured with him, but he was so young, so I didn't want I didn't want to make use of that advantage of being sort of a grown-up in a bus with a 15-year-old who liked to talk about his music and things like that. Would not be fair. So I've only sort of analyzed a few videos, and I also analyzed a little his Instagram account. So that's not much about him. Haris has done full circle, let's call it that. He entered a competition when he was 14, won the competition. That was an Awakening competition. They signed him. They had him tour. Maher Zain wrote him a number of songs. He did this first album that propelled him into superstardom, especially in Britain, but also in Indonesia, where he performed in a TV series about a young exchange student who happened to be a pop star who comes down to Indonesia to experience Ramadan. So he enters a normal class, and there's a lot of things, and the series is very sort of pedagogically talking about harassment and bullying, and well, yeah, a number of topics that generally pops up when you do sort of TV for youth. But it also contains him singing quite a lot. So he really was propelled into stardom. And he grew up with that, with the screaming fans, with that idea of being a star, made a few more songs for Awakening and a live album. But growing up with him is a generation of Londoner which are very much attached to the same culture as he, which is also influenced by rap culture in a way that the older generation of the Awakening is not. So he has now signed, he's now double signed, and Awakening is well aware of that and allows him to do that. So he has signed with some friends to be able to do other stuff, basically, where he comes across as another person than this devout young man. He's still very devout. He's a good Quran recitator, actually. Has a good voice for that. So one possibility is that it is diluted. The likely possibility, I think, is that it will gain so many different expressions, but it will still keep that kind of core where you have a contemporary, devout Islamic music, because there is definitely an audience for it. But sometimes in the theological circles, you separate between al-fan al-hadith and al-fan al-nadhif. Some of you might have noted those words on the PowerPoint. I skipped that part. Al-fan al-hadith means purposeful art and taps into that Platonic idea that morally good art is beautiful. Al-fan al-nadhif means clean art. It's basically avoiding the things, the subject that you shouldn't think about. So you shouldn't sing about drugs and well, you know what I'm talking about. So you simply strip that away, but then you sing about education or the love of for your mum or your wife or your country or whatever, and you still perform in the same circles as the other artists. Sorry. So that, yeah, there's many possible positions. And sorry for going on, but this really engages me, because there's also the traditional forms like that can transition into more popular culture. The obvious example is Qawwali, of course, with the huge success of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. But there is that Nawa in Morocco, for example, that has to a certain extent transitioned into rock music, but has not really broken through into general popular music, even though it's strong in spiritual circles. It's a Sufi music. And there's a number of traditions, like the Tunisian Hadra tradition, that has the potential of producing a popular singer that can break through and sort of find an audience outside of their immediate circles and the local circles.
Thank you very much. Actually, that's quite linked to the question I make to Rosaria, which is, what traction have pop nasheeds had in South Asia and Africa, where they have rich existing musical cultures? Sami Yusuf famously collaborated with Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. Is that a continuation of pop nasheed or a change of direction?
Well, when Sami Yusuf made his first album, you must remember that was in 2003, and he grew up in London. He was about 20, 23, something like that. And growing up in London in the 90s, he consumed a lot of Qawwali. So there's actually Qawwali covers on the first album. So they have never been separated. And the reason why they're called Awakening, that's actually a translation from an Urdu word that slips my mind at the moment, but it's part of an Urdu Naat song. And one of the guys in Awakening is of Pakistani origin. Another guy is from Bangladeshi origin. So even though I've talked a little about the English, the Arabic connection, I tend to end up there because I spent a lot of time in Egypt working as a tour guide, strangely enough, but after studying Arabic and things like that. So yeah, I'm connected to the Mediterranean basin more than I am connected to Pakistan, and Bangladesh I've never even been to, but Pakistan I've at least visited, and Iran I've visited a number of times. But I've been much more in Turkey and Egypt and Syria and Lebanon, etc., Tunisia, Morocco. So the music has an audience there, definitely. And some of the artists consciously record in Malay, in Urdu. There's definitely some who records a lot in Turkish. They have a reach, but the strong music culture, I mean, the Coke Studio have brought to life a fantastic music tradition, and well, brought to life, they yet put light on it, maybe. And there's a very strong musical scene in the domestic music scene in Malaysia and Indonesia. But the general trend has produced these kind of artists, and you can see that they're not only sort of performing in Britain and Canada, they are performing globally. And I know that the Awakening has arranged concert, for example, if you go to Africa, in Senegal, definitely North Africa, but also south of that. But I don't think that they've broken through as much in, let's say, East Africa, where you have the strong Tarab tradition in Zanzibar, for example, and they can't really compete on the Nigerian scene with a fantastic artist there, but they are a complement, and they are very well aware of those musical environments as they are a global company. But if you look at the Gulf, for example, they're very successful there. They're extremely successful in Indonesia, Malaysia. They're very successful in Bosnia and Turkey. They're fairly successful in Central Asia, and they're very successful again in North America and Europe. But it's a fantastic. I mean, the music scene in Nigeria is outlandishly good, for example.
Great, thank you. Let me ask one of the questions on YouTube. Have you looked at the role of hip hop culture intersecting with Muslim performers and storytelling? How important is this genre?
It's immensely important. I haven't looked at it, but one of my PhD students, former PhD students, he has defended successfully his PhD, Anders Ackfeldt, I'll write his name. He has written, among other things, on North American hip hop and the use of Islamic symbols in the lyrics. And there are other people I can recommend. Hisham Aidi, Rebel Music, which is a very good book that basically tells a story of what he calls a Muslim Atlantic. If you've are academics, you might recognize that there is an idea of the Black Atlantic, but he's sort of pushing in this Rebel Music book the Muslim Atlantic, and points how American jazz musicians went over to Morocco and communicated with the Nawa musicians, and how they both influenced each other. And you can hear Nawa melodies in 60s American jazz. You can also see that the way that the bass players played the upright bass and the electric bass in the US affected how you structure the bass playing in Nawa music. So there's a lot of communication. But back to the hip hops, there are continuous interesting writing, and you can you can go for Monica Miller, Hip Hop and Religion, I think, her main book. I misspelled that a little, so maybe you can correct that when you write it. Monica Miller is an American scholar who has written generally on these kind of aspects of the oral tradition, hip hop, and the use of religion. But it's really, really crucial, and it has a long tradition. When you look at hip hop and the function in North Africa, you can see that in connection with the Arab Spring, it became extremely important, but not so much connected to not so much connected to religion, but more to political protest generally. And quite a number of the hip hop artists are rather critical of religion, just like quite a number of the metal musicians in the area are critical of religion rather than promoting it. Or they reserve certain parts of religion as authentic, like Sufism, and then they criticize the authoritarian state and criticize religion at the same time. So quite a lot of the hip-hop music is driven by the narratives, as you say, but they're rather talking about people's conditions rather than rapping about Islam or the benefits of finding an Islamic lifestyle. There are those who do that too, but there are actually more common in, let's call it diaspora sloppily, but in North Africa, North America and Europe. But there are some really interesting, I mean, you have, here in UK, you have Poetic Pilgrimage. Like that, which is two converts from Jamaican origin, actually, or Jamaican UK origin. Both of them sort of academically schooled, really clever women who write very interesting Islamic hip hop.
Great. We have run out of time, but I've got two quick questions. So I'm going to ask these two questions as the last ones, just because I feel like otherwise I've missed them out. So the first question is, why did you call the nasheeds pop nasheeds, given not all of them are pop? Secondly, which is completely different, so please treat them separately, is all the examples you've given are of male artists and male Islamic artists. Would you like to talk a little bit about the gender dynamic in this discussion?
Okay. The pop nasheed thing. The reason why I call it pop nasheed is because of the marketing thing that is mass produced on records and on digital recordings. It's part of a popular culture machinery. That's what I mean with it. It's not necessarily pop as a pop genre. Then again, it's quite often is pop genres. It's also a thing. When you market music, you record it in certain ways. So if you listen to a symphonic orchestra, it could be sort of very, very tiny sounds, and then it can explode, and the difference in the strength of the sound is huge. A pop record generally goes like this. So even when there's only a guitar and a singer, it's as loud as when the drums and everything comes on. So it's a very even level. It also has certain structures, like the 4 or 5 minute cut, the intro, verse, chorus, middle, verse, chorus, chorus, chorus to end, to fade. These kind of things are pop elements. And that's what I mean with the pop thing. When it comes to female artists, it's an interesting thing because, and thank you for asking this, because part of the study that I did is a study on masculinity. So it's an ethical masculinity study, because Awakening have not been able to sign female artists. They have a children's record with a fairly anonymous female singer, but she's Egyptian, and I've recorded her name, but you have to sort of track it down on the record. It's not very obvious. And they had this German Moroccan woman that they wanted to sign that sang out to Maher Zain in the green room, encouraged by her sister, both working as voluntaries. She has a tremendous voice, and I've heard her live, the only gig that she did on an Awakening concert, and she's really, really good. But she's also involved with her medical training, and she's sort of in her mid-20s. There's the family life, and at the end of the day, after recording with them, they back down. Now, there are female nasheed artists. Most of them are local talents, but there are a few who have broken through. Some of them are rather pop than nasheed, but might go for sort of the modest version of pop, like Yuna, which is one of the personal favorites of mine. Malaysian Yuna, no, Indonesian Yuna, no, God, she's Malaysian, or is she Indonesian? Sorry, I should know that right now at 9:30. I have to think about it, but look her up, Yuna with a Y. Muna Haidar is another personal favorite from the US. Has a master's in philosophy of religion, and you can really hear that in her lyrics. They are very clever and often very theoretically informed. And she has stuck out her neck a bit by addressing really complex issues, everything from Islamophobia to domestic violence and being stalked by people who have religious authority, etc. So she really dares to bring up a sensitive subject, and she's a global superstar now. Muna Haidar, I'll write her name here, and you should really listen to her. and the other one was Yuna. I wrote both names now. I've seen a number of artists in Central Asia and Bosnia, for example, who perform very often in groups, female artists in groups. They're not sort of making it in the bigger global market as global superstars. And I wouldn't say that there are, and I could be completely wrong now, apart from Muna Haidar and Yuna and a few others, there are very few global superstars. There are, of course, if you go to Qawwali, you can find people like Abida Parveen, who is sort of a master singer. I don't really know how old she is, but around 60, I would guess, who's had a long career and a fantastic music career and been propelled into fame again through the Pakistani Coke Studio program. And yeah, there are other artists. But I found it really interesting to make a study of when I had the Awakening in front of me and realized that, okay, they don't have any female artists. I started asking about female artists already in 2014 when I met Sharif at an occasion in Oxford. And he was already then saying, yeah, well, it's a sensitive topic, we want to, but, and then came the ethical thing, and maybe that's a good way to round off. We don't know how to launch her. Because, and we were walking together and he said, you know how people treat female artists. And I was sort of mumbling to myself, say, yeah, but you know how the female audience sexualize male artists also. But I didn't say that. We sort of just listened instead. And he found it ethically problematic to uphold at that time the morals and ethics that they had and launch a female artist. They couldn't figure out how they should do it, but they were working on it. And when I toured with them in 2017, one of the things that they, with pride, said to me, you're going to get a surprise on the last concert. You were talking about this. And I said, what are you talking about? No, you get a surprise. So they really, really wanted this. And they think that they have found a way. But at the end of the day, because of personal matters, they couldn't launch her.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for speaking for quite a long time. Lots of questions that came up really at the end, and that demonstrates the interest that people have in your work and your expertise. So thank you so much for joining us today. Just a couple of quick announcements before I finish. Next week we have a talk by Hassan Judi on our mosques achieving style and substance. He's the Deputy Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. Who, on the Sunday we have the birth anniversary of Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam, and the next week we have Dr. Imran Ali Pamjwani, who'll be speaking to us as part of a monthly series, and Arzu Ahmad the week after, talking about the human genome, as she's a researcher at Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and the week after by Dr. Humaira Iqtidar, who's a senior lecturer in politics at King's College, who will be talking about Islamic visions of tolerance, limitations, and opportunities. Thank you very much for joining us today, and for the future, for all of you who joined today, and we'd like to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.